Darkness clung to the bedroom like an unshakable presence, dense and unmoving. The air was still, thick with a silence that felt unnatural, as if the world itself had been frozen in time. The man lay motionless beneath the covers, his breath steady, his body heavy with sleep. Then, a sound. It was faint, just on the edge of perception. A whisper, feather-light, sliding through the quiet like a knife through silk. It wove itself into the stillness, threading in and out, growing louder, more distinct. Yet it was not one voice but many, overlapping, blending into a chorus of hushed murmurs. The man stirred. His consciousness drifted toward the surface of wakefulness, grasping at the sound even as his mind resisted. Something about it gnawed at the edges of his awareness, an unease creeping into his slumber. Then, again, closer this time, a whisper curling at the shell of his ear, intimate, deliberate. His eyes snapped open. The darkness yawned around him, unbroken by the glow of streetlights or the pale sliver of moon through the blinds. The room was the same as it had been when he had closed his eyes. A bed, a nightstand, a chair in the corner where he had left his clothes. Nothing had changed. Nothing was out of place. And yet, his skin prickled. He listened, his breath held tight in his chest. Silence, a deep, suffocating quiet. Had he imagined it? The echo of a dream slipping through the cracks of sleep. He exhaled slowly, pressing his head back into the pillow, trying to shake the uneasy weight clinging to his ribs. The darkness pressed in, thick and oppressive, but his exhaustion pulled at him, willing him back into its depths. Then, just as his eyelids grew heavy, it came again, a whisper, but this time he could make out the words. His name, spoken in a breathy, fragmented voice. Panic spiked through his veins like ice water, sending him bolt upright in bed. His fingers clawed at the bedside lamp, fumbling with the switch. Light flooded the room in a soft, warm glow, banishing the shadows to the corners. Nothing. The room was empty. The door remained shut. The chair in the corner, undisturbed. His pulse pounded against his temples. It had been real. He had heard it, felt it. The whisper had come from inside the room. He swallowed hard, scanning every inch of his surroundings. Slowly, he swung his legs over the edge of the bed, his bare feet meeting the cold wooden floor. A deep, sinking dread pressed into his stomach as he reached for the closet door, hesitating only a moment before pulling it open. Darkness. His own reflection stared back at him from the mirror on the inside of the door. His expression was tight, his eyes wide and uncertain. His shadow stretched long behind him in the glow of the lamp. Nothing. He released a slow breath and shut the door, rubbing a hand over his face. His mind was playing tricks on him. That had to be it. With a weary shake of his head, he reached for the lamp switch, hesitating only a moment before plunging the room back into darkness. He settled beneath the covers, telling himself that when morning came, this would all seem ridiculous. Sleep found him again, but it was not deep, and in the quiet, the whispers returned. They slithered through the darkness, curling around his consciousness, whispering his name over and over again. A chorus of voices, right at his ear. Sleep never truly returned after that first night. It became a fleeting, fragile thing, constantly shattered by the voices. They started as mere murmurs, drifting through the darkness like dead leaves carried by a restless wind. But as the nights passed, they changed. At first, they echoed him. When his mind wandered, they followed. If he thought of reaching for a glass of water, the whisper would say it before he moved. When he hesitated before stepping out of bed, it urged him forward, its breathy presence crawling down his spine. Then it got worse. The whisper did not wait for him anymore. It spoke before he could think, before he could form a thought. It was already there, floating in the air, dissolving into the silence. When his phone rang, the whisper said the caller's name a second before it appeared on the screen. When he dropped his keys in the hallway, it sighed, already knowing. At first, he tried to fight it. He tried to think of nothing, to empty his mind. But the whisper filled the void. It spoke things he did not want to hear, truths he had not yet realized himself. It laughed, soft and knowing. One evening, as he sat in his dimly lit apartment, staring at the black TV screen, the whisper spoke again. "You will cut yourself on the glass." The word sent a shiver down his spine. He clenched his fists, refusing to acknowledge it. But the whisper did not care if he listened. It had already spoken. A few minutes later, he stood to get a drink. His hand grazed the counter, knocking over an empty glass. It fell, shattering against the floor. He barely reacted before it happened, before a sharp sting bloomed across his palm. Blood welled up from a thin, clean cut. He sucked in a breath, staring at the crimson streak on his skin. The whisper had known. It had spoken it into existence. That was when he understood. It wasn't reading his mind. It wasn't guessing. The whisper was ahead of him. Days passed in a blur of exhaustion. The whisper grew bolder, filling the silence between his thoughts with its own. It stopped waiting for nighttime. It spoke to him in the mornings, in the shower, when he left for work. The man in the blue jacket will sit next to you on the train. He ignored it, but when he stepped onto the train, there he was, a man in a blue jacket lowering himself onto the seat beside him. "Your coffee will spill." An hour later, his sleeve was soaked in bitter liquid. "The elevator will stop at the 4th floor." A second before the doors opened, the number 4 lit up. It was relentless. The whisper did not simply predict his life. It dictated it. It wove itself into his reality, sinking into the moments before they happened, whispering them into existence. He stopped sleeping. He stopped eating. Every action felt preordained. A script he had never written, but was doomed to follow. The worst part was that it always spoke in the same voice, his own. One night, when exhaustion finally pulled him into an uneasy sleep, he dreamt. He stood in his bedroom, staring at his reflection in the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, distorted by the glass. His shadow stretched long behind him, cast by the dim glow of the street lamp outside. Then it moved. His breath caught in his throat. His shadow shifted, subtly, unnaturally, its head tilting when he had not moved, its fingers curling at its sides. A whisper slipped into his ear, soft and close. "You are almost ready to see." He woke up gasping, the sound of his own breath swallowed by the suffocating dark. The whisper had not spoken since he opened his eyes, but he knew it was still there. Watching, the whispers had stopped. For the first time in weeks, his mind was his own. The silence should have been comforting, but it wasn't. It was worse. It was waiting. He moved through his apartment with careful, measured steps, as if disturbing the air too much would break the fragile stillness. His body was a shell of what it had been, gaunt, sleep-deprived, stretched thin by paranoia. The whisper had dictated every step of his life, but now it was gone, and that absence terrified him more than its presence ever had, because he knew somehow that it had not left. It was only closer. It started with the mirror. He avoided them now. Reflections unsettled him. But this time, he couldn't look away. Something was wrong. His reflection was slow, a fraction of a second behind. A hesitation so minuscule it could almost be dismissed. Almost. His breath turned shallow as he raised a hand. The reflection followed, late again. His fingers trembled as he stepped back, but the man in the glass hesitated before mirroring him. And then, it smiled. He did not. His stomach twisted, nausea rising like bile. He stumbled away, the room spinning. But as he turned, he saw it again, its presence stretching from his feet, spilling across the wooden floor. His shadow. It was wrong. It lagged behind him, sluggish, as if unwilling to move. And then, just like in the mirror, it shifted when he had not. A whisper curled around his ear. "You see me now." His pulse pounded, ice filling his veins. It had never been inside his mind. The whisper had never come from nowhere. It had come from behind him. The darkness outside thickened, swallowing the city lights beyond the window. The air in the room grew dense, suffocating, pressing against his skin. Slowly, he turned his head, his breath caught in his throat. His shadow stood. It no longer clung to the floor. It peeled itself from the ground, rising with slow, deliberate purpose. Its form, his form, stretched, warping like ink spilling into water. And then, it stepped forward. The room quivered. The walls seemed to buckle, distorting as if the space itself rebelled against what was happening. He couldn't move. His body refused. The shadow took another step, and then another. Its face, his face, remained in darkness, its features indistinct, shifting, hollow. A whisper, but now it wasn't at his ear. It was coming from its mouth. "I have waited." His body jerked backward, but there was nowhere to run. The walls groaned, closing in. His breath came in ragged gasps, his vision swimming. "I am what comes next." The shadow was close now. It loomed over him, its form unraveling at the edges like smoke, tendrils of darkness licking at the air. He tried to scream. The shadow reached out, fingers elongating into blackened, skeletal points. And then, darkness. He woke up. A gasp tore from his throat as he shot upright in bed. The room was silent, still. Morning light streamed through the blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. A dream. It had to be. A nightmare, stitched from the weeks of paranoia and exhaustion. His breathing slowed. He ran a hand over his face, rubbing the exhaustion from his eyes. Then, a whisper, not from the room, from his own lips. "I have waited." His blood turned to ice. His hands shook as he reached for the bedside lamp, dreading what he already knew. He turned it on, and in the corner of the room, where the morning light should have cast his shadow, there was nothing. Nothing at all. His shadow was gone. But he knew the truth. It had not left. It had taken his place.